Here we go. Come on. Where are you? Hold on 1 second. I don't think it's coming up. What is wrong with this? Sorry. Let's see if that works. There we go. All right. Who's got me? Go for it. Awesome. Okay. So schools and colleges, education, especially literacy, becomes much more of a priority in colonial America as we head into the 1700s. It is most important in New England and the Middle Atlantic, where it's obviously used to train future clergy. I'm not saying the South doesn't have a desire to educate. It's just that the South is so focused on agriculture that the people that receive private and higher education in the South were most likely to be what? Wealthy and white, yes. White, wealthy males predominantly. Okay, like the FFVs had the opportunity to get a college education. But for the average kid in the colonial South, your education ended at about the middle school level. That was roughly about when it ended, and your life was mostly focused on agriculture. That's why we see an agrarian calendar established for education. All right, almost universally in colonial America. Germans brought kindergarten to the colonies, which was elementary education and essentially fundamentals for primary education. Primary schools start to develop in New England and the Middle Atlantic. The first city to establish a public school was Boston. But most small communities, are you all familiar with the legend of Sleepy Hollow? Okay, you know the character Ichabod Crane, who's the teacher that's hired to educate the community? That's pretty much what your public education looked like in colonial America. All right? As I said, as you go to the South, there's less emphasis on public education and more emphasis on private education. For example, have you all ever heard of Tucko Plantation before? It's off River Road. If you were to go over there and you saw the plantation home, directly to the left is a room that's smaller than this classroom, and that's where Thomas Jefferson received his primary education for part of his life. And that was he received that through a private tutor. More people were literate in New England and the Middle Atlantic than in the South, but the highest literacy rates, without a doubt, were in New England. Many people were educated in the home by mothers, or if they had the ability and the means, by private tutors. As I previously mentioned, in other parts of America, farm labor was the driving force for survival, therefore education was secondary. But over time, what we're going to see is colonial schools starting to evolve, right? In the early period of colonial education, the main emphasis was on religion and classics and orthodoxy. But as we move through the Enlightenment and we move into the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, we start to see changes in curriculum, not only for young children, but also at the collegiate level. Discipline was severe. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Corporal punishment was common. It's kind of crazy. Like, you guys are in some of the first generations in America that do not receive corporal punishment. And has anyone ever had parents out there talk about corporal punishment in school? Yeah, number of you guys. I think I was in the first grade when Virginia outlawed corporal punishment in schools. Now, I wasn't a particularly horrible kindergartner to get beaten in school, but that's how recent we've moved away from corporal punishment in education. I do want to point out that we start to really see a lot of change and also the establishment of new schools as we move into the 1700s. That this is not just places of higher education, but also more community schools and more private and public schools, and the Enlightenment has a big role to play there. More of a focus on liberal arts and sciences. Ben Franklin in Philadelphia helped launch an early version of high school. He also is going to be one of the leaders behind the establishment of the University of Pennsylvania. Has anybody ever visited Ukraine before? Oh, it's beautiful, if you ever get the chance. Sorry, I'm getting choked up here over all this education talk. Okay, colonial art. So most of our colonial art in the early years was what we would consider folk art, and we've looked at some of that folk art up to this point. But as times change, and as we move into the 1700s, the 18th century, there are going to be more recognizable American artists. Okay, most people in colonial America in the 1600s saw art and music and any type of activity that took away from labor as an activity of leisure for what group? The wealthy, right? Like, there's a really famous painting at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture with this woman who's probably in her late teens and early 20s, and she's sitting there with a bowback mandolin. And it's like, check it out. I'm gonna play the mandolin. I'm so filthy rich. So, yeah, that's not the common occurrence here. Because this kid or young woman was not working in the fields, right? She had the ability to learn how to play an instrument. And the family had the means to pay somebody to paint her holding the instrument. When we really start to move into the era of art in America, it's going to be as a result of the Enlightenment and as a result of the First Great Awakening. In fact, a lot of our early American artists not only produced portrait art or famous artistic scenes in American history, but a lot of them, their artwork is connected to religion as well. So I want to focus on 4 very important artists that kind of set the tone for American art heading out of the colonial period and into the early new nation. So we have John Trumbull of Connecticut. His father was absolutely furious that he wanted to become a professional artist. He saw it as a waste of his time. Trumbull will go on to become one of the most revered and most popular painters in America. He becomes an inspiration not only to other American artists, but also to European artists as well. He will ultimately be brought into the Royal Society in London for his artwork. Charles Wilson Peale of Philadelphia. He is one of our most famous portrait artists during the colonial period. He was also really close friends with Thomas Jefferson. We're actually gonna look at one of his famous portraits today. But has anyone ever been to the VMFA, Virginia Museum of Fine Art? There's a lot of Peales that are like original Peales that are at the VMFA. He was not only a portrait artist, he also was the first curator to establish America's first natural history museum in Philadelphia. He was a skilled taxidermist, notably his work with birds, and he also practiced dentistry. We're actually not done with him today. We're going to talk about him a little bit more as we move forward in the semester. Benjamin West, of Pennsylvania. He was from Springfield, Pennsylvania, outside of Philly, and John Singleton Copley of Boston. Both of these guys were actually professionally trained artists in England, and they became a huge inspiration for would-be artists in America, so much so that Charles Willson Peale would go on to study under John Singleton Copley. So, 4 of our most important provincial artists during the colonial period. Am I moving too fast? Is everybody good? Okay. So on the left, everybody recognizes this one, right? It's the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This is arguably Trumbull's most famous piece of artwork, because what piece of American currency that we don't use a lot of, but is still in circulation, is this on the back of? What? Yeah, good job. It's the $2 bill. It's on the back of the $2 bill. Jefferson's on the front. The irony of this painting is that this painting made a lot of the founding fathers a little upset, because that is how things may have looked on July 2nd. I don't know if you all realize this. July 2nd was supposed to be Independence Day. But they decided to revise the Declaration, upsetting a lot of these individuals, including Jefferson. So most of the people that are shown here were not there on the 4th. In fact, one of the only significant signatures that was signed on the 4th was John Hancock's. Did you guys know that before? Okay, some of you are saying yes, that's awesome. Over on the right, who is that? It's Jefferson, very good. That's Thomas Jefferson on the right, one of Peale's good buddies. But that's not even the most famous Peale portrait. On the left, we have The Death of James Wolfe by Benjamin West. I'm actually going to explain this painting in a bit more detail when we move into the next lesson. This was the British commander at the final and decisive battle of the French and Indian War, the Battle of Quebec. And then on the right, that is not Jack Black, looks a lot like him. That is a very famous silversmith from Boston that you all know well, and you don't even realize you probably know this guy. And you know them by him saying, "The British are coming." It's Paul Revere. Very good. He probably never said the British are coming. He probably said, "The regulars are coming," or "The redcoats are coming." We're going to talk more about Paul Revere as we move forward. But Paul Revere, his likeness is here on the right. We're going to talk more about him when we head into our next lesson as well. So that's some of our famous provincial art from the era. This portrait I absolutely love. Has anyone ever tried to do a self-portrait before? This is a challenge, right? To try to do a self-portrait. I have a lot of respect for this piece of art. This is a self-portrait of Charles Willson Peale pulling back the curtain on his Natural History Museum in Philadelphia, which I think is pretty cool. All right, so provincial culture. Architecture in the colonies was predominantly imported from Europe, okay? So, like, colonial-style architecture in New England mimicked that of English-style architecture back home. Dutch architecture in New York, which was formerly New Amsterdam, mimicked agriculture back home. Has anyone ever been to H. Croft Hall before? That's what we call Tudor style. That was brought from England. But by the time we get to the early 1700s, there's a style of architecture in colonial America, and notably colonial Virginia, that has some lasting staying power. And that style of architecture is Georgian style. Because what it focuses on is the use of red brick, a lot of symmetry. How many people out there have gone to visit Colonial Williamsburg or William and Mary? Okay. the whole place is dominated with Georgian-style architecture. If you guys ever go to the west end of Richmond, the near west end, just outside of Carytown, are y'all familiar with where I'm talking about? Georgian-style architecture all over the place. Because it was easy in colonial Virginia, especially in this region, to mass produce brick. So brick becomes a useful resource for the building of homes and larger buildings and churches. All right? Keep an eye peeled. Georgian-style architecture is all around us. The log cabin, borrowed from the Swedes, will dominate the backcountry and was widespread in colonial America. Colonial literature really starts to take off in the early 1700s because what do we have more access to in the colonies? Printing presses. Very good. All right? One woman in particular that was quite famous was Phyllis Wheatley. She was born into slavery, never had any formal education, ultimately went to England and went on to publish a book of verse. She returned back to America, to Boston, and she went on to publish poems on various subjects, religious and moral. She becomes the first African-American woman to become a published author in America in the colonial period. Ben Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, without a doubt, was the most popular and widely circulated almanac in the colonial period. Mainly mass-produced out of Philadelphia. It offered a mixture of seasonal weather forecasts, practical household hints, puzzles, bless you, amusements. It had these funny sayings and quips, like this one you've all heard before, a penny saved is a penny earned. Everybody's heard that, right? At some point in their life. Yeah. This is my favorite. 3 may keep a secret if two of them are dead. I think that's a really great one. The only thing that sold more copies than Poor Richard's Almanac annually was the Bible. All right? But that is until we get to, when we get deeper into the colonial period, or toward the end of it, we're going to see some other, revolutionary ideas widely circulated and published. Has anyone ever heard of a guy by the name of Thomas Paine before, and his pamphlet Common Sense? We're going to talk about its wide circulation when we get a bit further in lesson 6. Ben Franklin's experiments with science, the kite and key test, and the development of the lightning rod, and his power of observation helped advancements in science and everyday life. So on the left, we have Phyllis Wheatley, and on the right, we have Poor Richard's Almanac. Any questions up to this point? Is everybody good? All right. So that takes us to the John Peter Zenger trial. Before I talk about who John Peter Zenger was and why this was controversial, we need to keep in mind that there are very few public lending libraries in America. Access to information and access to books was very much limited to the wealthy. Ben Franklin establishes the first lending library in Philadelphia. And some other lending libraries will pop up, but not on a large scale. So, more printing presses are established, which allows for people to crank out pamphlets and books and poems and leaflets and almanacs and newspapers. And the colonists are starving for information, especially as literacy rates go up. So a lot of these start to be widely circulated. Also, a number of these are published under pseudonyms or pen names. Why might a colonial journalist use a pen name? Exactly. We take our freedom of speech and press for granted. There was a great deal of freedom of speech and press in the colonies, but it was limited. You could not outright criticize colonial officials especially those who were appointed by the crown. So a lot of people would either anonymously publish work or use pen names to prevent their arrest and possible jail time, or even worse, execution for treason. Two of Ben Franklin's famous pen names were Poor Richard and Silence Dogood. Groundbreaking case for free press. John Peter Zenger, German immigrant, comes to America, establishes a printing press in New York. His paper, the New York Weekly Journal. He was taken to court and charged for seditious libel. If you don't know what that is, it basically means writing in a malicious, false manner against someone. This charge was due to his publication of a story about Colonial Governor William Cosby. The Colonial Governor had removed Chief Justice Lewis Morris, who will later be a signer of the Declaration of Independence, over a ruling on his salary. Zenger reported that Cosby did in fact replace the judge in order to make more money for himself. Now, when this goes to trial, the judge tells the jury, look, whether this is true or false, it is illegal for a columnist to publish a story against a colonial official. That's illegal, whether it's true or false. And they understand that. So Zenger is actually defended by one of the top colonial defense attorneys in all of colonial America, and that's Andrew Hamilton, no relation to Alexander, by the way. He defended him, and he actually wins the case. The jury acquits John Peter Zenger of seditious libel because all of the accounts that he has published are true. This is a huge moment for freedom of both press and speech in colonial America before the American Revolution unfolds. So, this is the trial of John Peter Zenger, the Zenger trial. Questions up to this point? All right, cool. All right, so the great game of politics. At the dawn of the Revolution, roughly 8 colonies were governed by royal governors who had been appointed by the king. 3 of the colonies were governed by governors who had been appointed by the proprietors or the majority landowners of a colony, and the remaining were considered what we call charter colonies, which is not very hard for us to remember, right? Because Virginia was a charter colony, as was Massachusetts Bay. They elected their officials through popular vote. And for a time, Rhode Island would fall into that category as well. Practically every colony utilized a 2-house legislative body. There was an upper house and a lower house. The upper house was those representatives were either chosen by the crown or by the land proprietors. And the lower house was elected by the people. This is similar to what 2-house system that is the lawmaking body of Great Britain. Starts with a P. Parliament. Very good. And obviously, when we get to lesson 7, we're going to talk about the creation of our own 2-house, upper house and lower house legislature, the Senate and the House of Representatives. We'll get to that later. Something that's important is that the colonists taxed themselves. They levied their own taxes from colony to colony. And remember, in a number of colonies, they also were required to pay an established church tax. That was if they were in an Anglican-controlled colony or in a Congregationalist Puritan colony. So you have to understand, as we move into lesson 5, one of the things that bothers the colonists about being taxed by the British is that they feel that it's unfair because they're already taxing themselves. They don't feel that Britain has the authority to tax them. They have taxation with representation in their own colonies. Does that make sense? Because they have representative governments levying their own taxes. Most of your governors were really good and respected by the people overwhelmingly. If we did like a roll call on colonial governors over time, most colonial governors had a pretty decent relationship with the people. Now, we already learned about one. Remember Edmund Andros? They had the Boston Revolt, and they threw him in jail. He was the leader of the Dominion of New England. There's another one that is arguably the worst and most controversial colonial governor, and that is Lord Cornbury, better known to us his name's Edward Hyde. But Lord Cornbury was the first cousin of Queen Anne, and from 1701 to 1708, he was the royal governor of New York and New Jersey. And while he was governor, he pretty much emptied out the treasury of these colonies and embezzled all their money to the point that they had to remove him from his office. So it's a very controversial series of events. Another really controversial royal governor was Lord John Murray Dunmore, who's the last royal governor of Virginia. And I'm going to talk about him in more detail when we get to lesson 5. But there were some beloved royal governors. There's a really famous one from Virginia that you guys have probably heard the name, at least if you've spent any time on the other side of the state. Have you ever heard of the name Botetourt before? Okay, Lord Botetourt. Well, Lord Botetourt was so beloved by the people of Virginia, upon his death, they raised money and erected a statue in his honor. Like, that was kind of unheard of during the colonial period. So, not every colonial governor was despised. More were liked than hated. The right to vote was afforded to white male landowners 21 and over. Native Americans, African Americans, and nearly all women were left out of the voting process. Now, there is an exception, and that is in New Jersey. For a little small window of time, there were a group of women in New Jersey that had the right to vote during the colonial period. These women were what? Yes, they were definitely white. Not yet. They were widows, and they did not remarry. And that didn't last long. I mean, two of the biggest missed opportunities at the end of the colonial period and heading into the early new nation, number one, and first and foremost, not abolishing slavery, and number two, not providing women with the right to vote. I mean, think of how different things would have unfolded had the institution of slavery been abolished and women had received the right to vote early on. Raleigh Tavern. Why would I pull up a picture of Raleigh Tavern? This is sort of like messed up, but it's funny. I always think about people all over the world visiting colonial America, and they get here and they're like, yeah, I'm going to go grab a drink. And they go in there and it's just a bunch of reenactors. You can't. This is just part of the tour. But why would this tavern be important in Williamsburg during the colonial period in terms of politics? Ava?
It's where politicians used to discuss stuff.
Yes. They would go booze it up and talk politics, shoot billiards, shoot the bull, right? Catching up about politics. This is actually a very important building in American history because when the House of Burgesses was disbanded and the Revolution was about to begin, this is the first spot that a lot of those members of the House of Burgesses went to meet, and they're going to decide they're going to move their operation out of Williamsburg and move it to where? Richmond. They're going to move it to Richmond. We'll talk about how things wind up in D.C. a bit later. D.C. is a good guess, but they're going to move their operation to Richmond. All right, this is where we pump the brakes today, Colonial Folkways. Americans had a lot of hardships. They lacked basic amenities. There's no running water. There's no plumbing. Garbage disposal is very primitive. This is actually super weird, but during COVID, I don't know if you realize this, but archaeologists kind of went nuts during COVID because they had like all this time on their hands, right? And they had a lot less. Oh, I'm gonna have to go for just 5 minutes. They had a lot of time on their hands, but also a lot of archaeologists didn't have the foot traffic coming through, so they were able to do a lot more digging and find a lot more discoveries. And this is super weird and super gross, but one of the main archaeological digs that happened in Boston during COVID was the archaeological dig under Paul Revere's outhouse, where it's sat. I think that's kind of gross, but it's pretty wild. If you guys are interested, I'll pass that article along related to the archaeology of Paul Revere's outhouse. Anyhow, amusements were permitted. People often worked and partied together for these amusements. So house raisings, barn raisings, y'all know what I mean by that. Everybody's pitching in to build a house or a barn in a community. Apple pairings, quilting bees. I don't know if anybody's ever sat together and made a quilt together, but that's what a quilting bee is. Husking bees and other merrymaking dances, minuet dances. One of the greatest dancers in colonial America. All the ladies were lined up to dance with him. George Washington. He was a minuet man. You guys are probably looking at this and you're like, I've never participated in anything like that in my life. But I would imagine that some of you have probably participated in a husking bee and you didn't even know it. How many of you all sat around with your family and shuck corn together? That's a husking bee. So next time you're with the family, hey, having a great time with you guys this husking bee. Stage plays, dances, card playing. Where are my card players at? A lot of the card games that we still play today have been handed down for generations. That was another thing about Washington. He was a big card player. The guy would gamble on anything. Billiards. Has anyone ever played bumper pool before? Like red ball versus white ball? No? Ever played? Okay. That was kind of like the early billiards game. It was kind of like a game of knockout without bumpers. And the table was way larger than the regulation billiard table is in. You have the players in the house. If you ever go down to Raleigh Tavern, you can see what a colonial era billiard table looks like. Horse racing was big. Cockfighting, which was very sad, but also, they gambled on it. Children's games, fox hunting. Does anybody out there besides me have a dog that is some part breed of an American foxhound? Just me? All right, nice. So those dogs were bred by George Washington. They're one of our few American bred dogs for fox hunting. He was a big fox hunter. These are all sources of entertainment. Lotteries were universally approved to raise money for colleges, communities, and churches. So holidays were celebrated all over the colonies. Any ideas what the most famous and most universally celebrated holiday was? Christmas. Very good. Somebody asked about Thanksgiving earlier. Thanksgiving's a little tricky because the universal celebration of Thanksgiving doesn't happen until after the American Civil War. Thanksgiving becomes a national holiday during the Civil War. That's a legacy of Abraham Lincoln. But obviously we know that the first Thanksgivings were celebrated back in the colonial period. I don't know how many of you guys are out there horse racing fans or grew up around the sport. I did. My aunt lives and has for a long time about 5 miles from a horse track. The way horse racing is today is not quite, I mean, you can still see similarities to the way horse racing was then. Basically, what the style of horse racing that they participated in then was more like what we would call quarter horse racing. So it's kind of like a sprint style racing. Interestingly enough, guess where some of the most famous colonial horse races were? In Virginia. Some really famous ones. Salisbury. Isn't that interesting? They had quite a bit of horse racing that happened up there. All right. Comments, questions, concerns? All right, cool. So, I hope you have enjoyed learning more about colonial America. Please let me know if you have any questions. And I'm sorry I ran over there. My apologies.